Welcome to prayer meeting tonight. Our devotional is the grace of giving, and we'll be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. We'll read verses 7 through 15. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, starting at verse 7. But as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all diligence, and in your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. What grace is he talking about there? This grace. Well, the church of Corinth abounded in several things Paul calls graces. One thing was faith and speech, knowledge, diligence, and their love for Paul. He called those things graces. And all this was good and necessary, but there was one more grace in which Paul wanted them to abound. And this grace is seen in verses 4 through 6, which he calls the grace of giving. Paul calls the Corinthians' attention that the churches in Macedonia were very poor, but they willingly gave far beyond what could be expected of them. If you recall the history there, in Israel, or Judea, there was a famine and poverty, and a lot of the Christians were suffering. And so churches in Asia Minor and southeastern Europe were taking up collections of money and whatever to send to the needy people there in Judea. So that's what he's talking about. And Paul is saying, look, the churches in Macedonia are very poor. Now, if you can picture in your mind where Corinth is, it's on the Greece, that comes down from Europe. Macedonia is just up and northeast on that coast there. So it's a little ways away. Basically Greek-speaking people, but different nationalities. And Paul says, look, they're poor, but they willingly gave far beyond what could be expected of them. The reason they could do this, he says, that they had first given themselves to the Lord, and then they gave money and support as the will of God led them to give. And that's the important thing about the grace of giving, is how God moves upon your will. Paul wants the Corinthians and us to abound or to overflow in this grace of giving. Generous and thoughtful giving is an evidence of God's grace, because God is a giving being. He gives us all the blessings of nature that meet our physical needs. How many ate breakfast this morning? How many ate lunch? How many ate supper? How many might eat a snack after you get home from church? Where did that come from? Well, say I bought it at the grocery store. Well, that's probably true, but it didn't just appear there. There are farmers that raised cattle, that raised hogs, that raised wheat, that raised whatever you ate. And how did they do that? Well, because God created certain natural laws, that when the farmers obey those laws, wheat grows, corn grows, peas grow, cattle grow, and so forth like that. So God is a giving being. He gives us more than what we could use if we just manage it properly. He also gives us all the blessings of nature, but more than that, he gave us his Son to meet our spiritual needs. Verses 8 and 9. He says, I speak not by commandment, but I'm testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. Paul sets down the divine precedent in the person of Jesus. He was not trying to give them some kind of apostolic commandment. he told them to measure their sincerity against the diligence of the others. Okay, he called to mind the Macedonians. Okay, so Corinthians, you know what you have. You may not know what they don't have, but you've promised to give something. Measure yourself by that, by being diligent that way. Now, he was not trying to he was not after the quantity of their giving. The issue was not in the amount of money the church should give. The issue was in the quality of giving. In other words, the motive behind the giving. And this is the value God places on any and all of our giving. God doesn't look at the dollar bills or the checks or the coins that come in the offering plate. He looks at the heart and the will of those that put those in there. Why do you give? What is your purpose? Well, Paul teaches us that Christ is the standard for all things in the Christian life. Therefore, we must follow the precedent that Jesus has set for us. And Paul says that Christ's giving was sacrificial. He gave willingly, and he demanded nothing in return. He was rich in his eternal glory, but he set that aside so that he could make possible our salvation from sin. So there is a grace in the giving of himself for our redemption that is to be reflected in our giving to others. Our giving should look resemble something like the giving of Christ. Now, he gave his life to purchase our redemption, okay? We can't save people from their sins, as Jesus did. But we can still have that same grace of giving of ourselves to help those who are truly in need. And may I underscore that, truly in need. The grace we have cannot meet all the needs of all the people on the earth, but it can reach out to the legitimate needs God brings to our attention. And there is the standard, okay? Verses 10 through 12, he says, "And in this I give advice. It is to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago, but now you must also complete the doing of it, that as there was a readiness to desire it, so there also may be completion out of what you have. For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have." So Paul is giving the Corinthians and us some personal advice. You see, they made a commitment a year earlier to collect funds to send to Jerusalem for the aid of the poor saints. And now it was time to do what they said they would do. Other churches had given money for the need, and it just might be that the Corinthians were beginning to feel that they did not have to give as much as they had originally promised. How about that? The idea being, why give more than what is really needed? Now, some people think that way. But you know, if you promised God that you're going to give X, and then you see that all other people are giving lots and lots, and you may come to the idea that, well, maybe I don't need to give X. Maybe I can give X minus 5 or something like that. And people do think that way. He tells them, in essence, that if you believe God laid that amount on your hearts a year ago, you must obey that leading and deliver what you promised. what you think are changes in the circumstances do not release you from what God laid on your heart. Okay? He admonishes them to follow through based on what they have and not on what they do not have. If God laid a burden on your heart, He will see that you are able to give it. Okay? A willing heart is the first consideration. And this is what God honors. God looks only at what you have to give, and God knows you cannot give more than you have. Again, it's not the amount that God looks at. It is the attitude of your will in giving. Then in verses 13 to 15, he writes, "For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. As it is written," and he's quoting now from the book of Exodus, "He who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack." You remember what that's about, don't you? When God gave the manna, they went out with an omer, and they were to collect an omer for each of the person in the family. If they, collected it, and maybe they said, "Well, I'm going to have 2 omers for me because I get hungry." What happened to that second omer? It rotted. And suppose, the 98-year-old widow was out there, and, she just had a hard time picking up the manna, and she only had about a quarter of the omer full. Guess what? That lasted all day. She wasn't being lazy. She was just doing all she could do. That's all she could get. So that's the principle that God has here. God deals in equality. God does not intend that one bear all the cost, but that those who can give according to what they have. And God has ways of evening things out. This is something that we really have to come to understand. And sometimes it's a challenge for people that have a lot more than others to really deal with this because they have a lot that they could give. And people know that. And sometimes the less affluent people in the congregation, there's a need and they write a check for $100. And that's a lot of money to them because that really lowers the numbers in their checkbook. But they look at good old brother back there who they know is a very wealthy man, and they're thinking that, well, if I give $100, he could give $10,000. Okay? Well, God just says those who can give according to what they had, because God has ways of evening things out. Today it may be that you have more to give than others. Okay? However, at another time it may be that you are the one in need, and others will come to your aid and supply your need. And that could be done financially or in some other way that meets a need in your life at that time. So, maybe you have some wealth and you continually give to the work of God. Then you have a need in your life. It may be that you're not broke, you didn't lose your job, but maybe you're ill and you're in the hospital. And the saints, they come and they rally around you. They come and they visit. They come and they pray for you. They take food to the home and encourage you. They know you can't cut your grass, so they get out there, they mow their lawn. So it's not dollar for dollar, item for item, but God takes care of the needs. God knows how much He expects you to give. And when the tables are turned, God has a way of supplying your need, not just to the amount that you gave financially, sometimes in ways that are even more significant than that. So Paul refreshes our minds with the truth about the Israelites when they gathered the manna. He who had gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. This principle still applies in Christian giving. God has a way of making things equal, and it is not up to us to decide what the equal is. Because if that were so, we would invariably try to make things equal in our favor. That's just kind of human nature. So, giving shows God we trust Him. And trust in God is a pathway of grace in this life. The grace of giving. Amen.